Don't leave here saying, Dr. Bock told me ADHD is on the spectrum. If your child has ADHD, he's not in the spectrum. 3 classic symptoms: lack of focused attention, hyperactivity, and impulsive. There's outbursts that children may have. And the subtypes are primarily hyperactive or impulsive, predominantly inattentive, or combined hyperactive, impulsive, and inattentive subtype. So, and it varies, because the medications may be different depending on the subtypes. Now this is important because this is basically saying that there's a lot of overlap between ADHD and PDD, but that if a child meets the criteria for pervasive developmental disorder, which is supposedly, quote, more severe than ADHD, they don't get the diagnosis. They're excluded from getting the diagnosis of ADHD. So in essence, PDD or ASD or autism trumps ADHD. But yet but are they really separate or distinct disorders? And the reality is there's a lot of literature here saying that there's a lot of overlap. A lot of the kids with autism and PDD have a lot of ADHD features, and a lot of kids with ADHD may have PDD or autistic features, but not enough to diagnose them with PDD or autism. So there's a heck of a lot of overlap. And the bottom line, what I told you before, we need to name these so we can communicate with each other. We know what a child has. We get a sense of what we might have to be dealing with. But the reality is the name of the game is way beyond the name. It's what underlies the name, okay? Again, genetic risks in ADHD modified by environmental factors, just like autism. And this happens to be a gene on the dopamine receptor, the dopamine D4 receptor. Dopamine is your neurotransmitter of attention. So dopamine is very important, right? And this is a receptor that interacts with the methionine synthase. I'm going to show you again where that is. That's the enzyme in the methylation cycle. And that this receptor is affected when the methionine synthase activity is affected by things like oxidative stress and heavy metals and lower glutathione levels. And so you affect this receptor, and when you affect the dopamine receptor, you affect attention. So again, you can have decreased attention, but it's nice to know where it may be coming from, so where we can intervene to help it, not just with Ritalin and those kind of things, which can have a lot of side effects. So this is the methionine synthase enzyme, part of this methylation cycle, remethylating homocysteine to methionine with the cofactor of methyl B12. This is why methyl B12 can help kids with the spectrum, ASD, PDD, and also with ADHD. You can help attention and hyperactivity in the right kids. And here we see it a little more complex, but we see here's from another point of view, now the glutathione's on top, and the methionine synthase is here in other cells involved with methylating DNA. Remember, this is involved with development and turning off and on DNA. And here it's involved with this dopamine receptor where you're methylating some of the lipids, the phospholipids in the cell membrane involved with attention. And what happens is, if you have increased oxidative stress, how many times have I said these kids are under increased oxidative stress? Autism and ADHD. In the effort to increase the glutathione to buffer this oxidative stress, remember as a major antioxidant, what happens is the oxidative stress shuts off a couple of enzymes. One of the enzymes that turns cysteine into taurine and sulfate, so a lot of the kids are low in taurine and sulfate. And also it shuts down the methionine synthase to try to prevent the homocysteine from going back here. It wants it to go up to glutathione. So it inhibits the methionine synthase. And therefore, one of the ways we can help this is by giving methyl B12 and methylfolate, methylators. And this is in graphic form. Mercury is a profound inhibitor of this methionine synthase enzyme. And therefore, it ultimately affects glutathione because this whole cycle is important for glutathione. And what else potently inhibits this enzyme? In addition to oxidative stress, lead, mercury, alcohol, and thimerosal, that preservative that was in the vaccines and also is in some types of products. And it's not out of all the vaccines. You know, the swine flu vaccination, most of them had thimerosal. And who were they telling first to get immunized with swine flu vaccination? Pregnant women and kids. Giving pregnant women a swine flu vaccination with thimerosal, to me, is a very, very bad thing. And that's where I really disagree with public health policy. You want to give swine, there's a lot of problems, I think, with swine flu vaccination in terms of possible side effects, but you got to have it from aerosol free to give to a pregnant woman. It's just, in one of the states in our country, Washington State, they had a law forbidding thimerosal to pregnant women, and they, because of the quote swine flu scare, they basically said, forget the law right now, and they just massively, and I think it's a problem. So these are the kind of things, unfortunately, that I think may contribute to some of the problems. So we have to, that's why I'm very much in favor of a more safe vaccination policy. And I would like to see thimerosal out of every vaccination, every flu vaccination, so a lot of them have it too, in addition to the swine flu. This just shows the effects of low-dose mercury. We're not talking about heavy, heavy toxicity like you just broke a thermometer. And you know, I don't know if you guys are a little younger than I am, but we were younger, we almost played with that. We thought mercury was so cool. You broke a thermometer, you play with it. Unfortunately, that is very, very toxic. We're talking about more chronic low-dose mercury toxicity, and in kids, deficits in language, late talking, problems with memory, deficits in attention, and autism, deficits in ADHD, okay? Now lead, I'm going to have to run through this because of time, because I'm going extra slow so you understand this, but lead is really interesting because lead is one of the classic examples of a toxin that over time we've realized lower and lower levels are more toxic. So that before 1970, we thought the dangerous level was 60. Then by 1985, it dropped to 25. In between there, it was 45. And by 1991, it's 10. So 10 micrograms per deciliter was considered the level for concern. That's what it still is 20 years later, 19 years later. The problem is, in the intervening 20 years, especially in the last decade, especially in the 2000s, there's all this medical literature showing that basically lower levels of lead are problematic to developing nervous system of children. They can be affected at blood levels less than 10. And for children, there may be no threshold for developmental effects. And yet we've still kept the level at 10. So if you go to your pediatrician, you get your lead level, and you said it's 9, he says, oh, it's 9, it's below 10, it's okay. That's not okay. That's not okay. Because what happens is, in terms of the lead retention in the tissues, and it leaves the blood in about 35 days. So like, you know, maybe 5, 6 weeks, 2 months. It leaves the blood and goes to tissues, and if you measure the blood, you might not even see it if the exposure's gone. But it can cause behavioral and learning disorders, ADD, ADHD, sensory deficits, kids with visual and auditory and sensory problems, motor deficits, cognitive dysfunction, memory loss, depression, confusion, a lot of things we see in kids on the spectrum as well as ADHD. Lead has a lot of neurotoxicity at low levels. And this is just an article that shows, look at these levels, these are less than 2. There's an increasing amount of ADHD as you increase, way less than 2. So what if this is way less than 10? So what this article said, and I have too much, I couldn't show you all the different papers, obviously, but their conclusion was blood levels below the CDC action level, and this needs to be changed, of 10 micrograms per deciliter are associated with an increased risk for ADHD. This result is consistent with previous studies, and these are in very good journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, 2003, that found cognitive deficits in children with blood levels less than 10. So if you get a 5 and your pediatrician says, oh, you're fine, it's not fine. It may be no lead. I mean, we'd like to have 0. It's hard to, you never get 0. It says less than 3 or whatever. But the point is, that's why we do what you'll see later is provoke urines to see what's in the tissues, because it leaves the blood. And unless you have an acute or ongoing exposure, it leaves the blood. And it's not all that it just leaves the body. It goes into the tissues where it has its effects. So low levels of lead can cause attention deficits, cognitive dysfunction, lower IQ scores, difficulty regulating emotions, and delinquency. How many juvenile delinquents are heavy metal toxic, lead, mercury maybe, and never ever tested and never will be tested? And how many have lives that are lost basically? We don't know, but I think it's probably significant. Just important to recognize. And food additives and hyperactive behavior. Preservatives like sodium benzoate and food colorings and things. For years, we've been, the Feingold diet with salicylates, and in my field, integrative medicine, we've been talking about this for years, and it was poo-pooed by mainstream for years and years. right? And then what happens? And this is published in The Lancet, 2007, a very respected British journal, right? And in November of 2007, I was lecturing in Scotland, very soon after this was published, with a professor from the university where this was published, and said this was an impeccable, fantastic study, double-blind, placebo-controlled, that showed that hyperactive behavior was related, that food additives, colorings, the preservatives, were related to hyperactives in 2 cohorts of kids, 3 years old and 8 and 9-year-old. I'm sure it's many more than that. That was what was tested, but this was just an example. And basically, they said this was a rigorous control of the placebo effects for the full range of levels of hyperactivity. And we have found an adverse effect of food additives on the hyperactive behavior of 3 years old and 8/9-year-old children. Okay, and it's not just in kids with ADHD. It can exacerbate those kind of symptoms even in the general population. The point being now, a pediatrician could never say to you anymore, diet doesn't affect hyperactivity because of this study. So now they believe it. So the point is, there's a lag time in medicine. It takes 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years for what's really going on to get verified in these large double-blind placebo-controlled studies. A lot of times there's no financial interest, so they're not going to do it. It costs millions and millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions. If they don't have a drug to do it, they're not going to do it. So the bottom line is sometimes, and this is why we base everything I'm talking is based in science, but you have to have a level of clinical expertise to help these kids. They can't wait 15 years. We have to help them now, so we have to use the science and extrapolate it to the clinical in the safest way we can. Always weighing out the risks and benefits. But now the pediatricians can't deny this. The pediatrician tries to poo-poo it. You just show this article, and there's no denying it. Okay. Now, asthma. So are ADHD, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia allergy-related? And I put this in again to show you that I'm talking about kids, but chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, also very intertwined. A number of the parents I see of the kids have these things because there are adult equivalents of these disorders in the kids. And basically this is saying that food allergies and adverse reactions to foods may play a role in ADHD and also CFS and fibromyalgia. So, okay. And then we go to asthma, which again, remember I showed you how the immune system is skewed, and I don't have the time to unfortunately get into the immune system, it's too complex. I have whole lectures on that as well. But I just want you to know that there's the imbalance, and the imbalance a lot of times is to this Th2 skewing, which is, asthma is a Th2 skewed chronic inflammatory disorder. And there's a thinking that basically one of the things that happens when a neonate is born is you have to educate the immune system. And part of that education is done by our microbes, the healthy microbes in the gut. And what is happening? I'm amazed at how many kids, and that basically, that there's a, that this is a whole hygiene hypothesis, that we don't have the healthy bacteria, like the kids that grew up in farms and are playing in all that cow poop and exposed to all those barnyard stuff. It helps to basically expose them to good intestinal bacteria to help educate the immune system in the proper way, so you have this balance, so that you get the regulatory T cells to kind of bring out that harmony. And that if you don't have this regulatory networks, you get immunological mayhem, and you get all these disorders. We're seeing eczema, allergic rhinitis, asthma.